Parents, what weird or creepy stories do you have about your child's imaginary friend? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. My 15-year-old is autistic, and still has imaginary friends. He's had several over the years. Couple of freaky things. First, when he's talking to the imaginary friend, he uses different voices for different friends. So he'll be in his room and you'll hear 3 or 4 different voices coming from a room where there is only one person. Then there was the time he had 2 little kid imaginary friends. One was Sissy, and the other was Brother. He said they lived under the tree outside his window, and would tell him to do things, which he did, then got in trouble for. Then one day he walked in and said, "Sissy said they have to leave and wanted to tell you bye." He never mentioned them again, not like they were there. It was, "I miss Sissy and Brother, there's a few more but I'll have to try and remember." Imaginary friend name. Tommy. My son 4 years had this imaginary friend named Tommy. He used to throw balls against the wall and said that Tommy was catching it. But once I heard my son screaming, and when I come into the kitchen I see my son standing with his hand literally stabbed through. My son doesn't have the mental strength to even dive into a pool, so how could he have stabbed his hand? He said Tommy did it. Not my child but my 2 little cousins, 2 and 4 were playing together under a table on my grandma's house. I was standing near the table. 2 started crying but 4 seemed completely normal, so I asked what happened. 4 told me, "She's crying because of that ugly man." Me. "What ugly man?" She pointed next to the 2 and said, "That ugly man, can't you see him?" There was obviously nothing there. I got scared and ran away. Lol. Mr. Nobody. He started as the person the kids would blame if one of them forgot to flush the toilet. And then his mythology evolved. For the record, all of this was conceived by 3 of my kids who at the time were 6, 5, and 3. Mr. Nobody has no eyes, no teeth, no tongue and no nose. He doesn't wear pants and leaves the used toilet paper between his butt cheeks so you can tell where he is by his smell. He doesn't wear a shirt, but has a pocket cut into his skin where he keeps the key to our house. He can be invisible. He had a beard since he was a baby. He bites off his fingernails and then drips blood where he walks. A friend of mine drew him at the time. Blue was my son's imaginary something. I wouldn't exactly call him his friend. He started mentioning Blue when he was around 3 and didn't stop until he was about 6. When we questioned who Blue was, what he looked like, where he came from, my son, Billy, gave the oddest answers. Blue just was. Billy seemed to encounter him most often in the backyard and Blue would follow him in. My husband, Bill, was the first to notice Billy talking about Blue. Bill asked him who Blue was and Billy would motion to something that wasn't there. He would say things like, "Blue says you can't see him or hear him." When asked what Blue looked like, Billy would shrug and say he had no shape and was a cloud. A blue cloud? We were trying to understand. But Billy said no, Blue wasn't blue. That was just what he was. We let it alone, but kept an eye on him. Especially when Billy stopped wanting to go into the backyard because Blue would want to talk to him and he didn't want to talk. "What does Blue talk about?" We asked him. "Stuff." "What kind of stuff?" A couple of times my niece, who was a year older than Billy, who was maybe 5 then, said there was a ghost in the backyard who wouldn't leave them alone. We asked her about it, which was probably a mistake, since it likely lent credence to what probably was just an overactive imagination. Anyway, she said she couldn't see it, only feel it. And she could sometimes hear it speak, and it spoke in another language too, and it wanted Billy to talk to him but Billy wouldn't because Billy said that Blue was boring. At one point I remember, out of the blue, no pun intended, Billy asked us a bunch of questions about war, more specifically if it was true that some bodies were never recovered. He said Blue talked a lot about ugly things that happened in war. He even said rape, which was when we really became alarmed. So much so that we sought help from his pediatrician who up until then had just dismissed Blue as an imaginary friend. Her thought was that he must have heard some kids talk about it at school. Maybe one of them had a veteran relative who overheard tales and regaled friends at school with bits and pieces of these accounts. It made sense, but when we asked Billy about it he just stared at us askance and insisted Blue had told him. It was around this time that we moved. Not because of Blue, but because the school district wasn't great and honestly neither was the neighborhood we were living in. So we sold up and moved 20 miles or so north of the city, to a small township that at the time seemed quiet and idyllic. Blue did not follow. Billy is now in his 20s. A couple of years ago we were reminiscing about stuff in general when my niece, who was also in attendance since it was a family party, mentioned Blue. Billy was surprised and said he vaguely remembered talking to someone but never really gave it much thought because the person was boring, talked a lot, usually in a monotone he couldn't really hear, and would become upset if he didn't understand. We asked again what he looked like and he shrugged and said, "Just a guy." "But you said he didn't look like anything." "You said he looked like a cloud," we insisted. "Yeah, but that was only at first. I began to see him after a while. He was just a man. Probably a homeless guy or something." We all looked at each other and back at him. Then he realized what he just said. The impossibility of it, so to speak. "Wow, so I guess I used to talk to a ghost?" Pawpaw. It was actually me. I had an imaginary friend named Pawpaw and I guess he started out cool but then started scaring me. I guess my parents were so convinced it was a ghost or something they had an exorcism performed on the house. I guess afterwards I him a few more times but he was outside looking in through my upper level window. Later I saw a drawing my brother did of a stormtrooper and said it looked like Pawpaw. My mom is fully convinced it was another little boy who died and wanted to take over my body. Sometimes I wonder if I am Pawpaw. Rolling on the floor laughing. Part of how my anxiety manifests is through paranoid delusion, which made for an interesting go of figuring out what the fuck I was talking about as a kid. I would pour whole sodas and other drinks down the drain, and claim I was feeding the dragon who lived in the basement. This was imperative, not a fun hobby. That giant fucking lizard in the boiler room was going to engulf the building in hellfire if I didn't feed him. I was saving lives. I was about 10 or 11 years old when my parents figured out I was fucked up and that I really believed there was a dragon in the basement of all of our homes. My house has something wrong with it. We moved when my boy was 5 years or something. Good little sleeper. We kept his sound machine and crib and nightlight and even the wall decal from the old house. He would wake up middle of the night terrified. Like not a come see me cry, more like a you need to get here now I'm in danger scream. It highlighted one night when he told Hughes there was an old lady in the corner waking him up. I assured him it was fine and obviously didn't fucking look. He had a nice imaginary friend Joe that talked to him too. One night we were making dinner and just left him coloring at the kitchen table. He pauses and gets this little gruff voice and says to himself, "Back straight. Sit up," and sits more upright in his chair. We never chirped at him about posture or anything, we would just be happy if he was at the table eating. The in-laws were bothering him one night about Joe and asking where he was. Had a good laugh. He turns, very seriously, and says, "You're lucky he's gone away for a while. He doesn't like you." Laughed got clipped quickly. He also told us the reason our younger daughter couldn't sleep was because the brown shadows wake her up to play with them. That was freaky. Cherry on that one was a neighbor told us she had a dream that our daughter can't sleep because the spirits want her to entertain them. We also hear creaks and groans in the house like a heavy-set individual is walking the hall or taking the stairs. We've also had guests who swear they've had something walking behind them or pulling on their shirt to get their attention when all the kids were outside playing. Also witnessed books coming off shelves 3 times and landing several feet away from the bookcase. Not a parent, but I have a much younger brother. About 4 years ago I was still living with my parents and we moved into this big creepy 5-bedroom home, and my baby brother, maybe 4 or 5 at the time, was always talking about the girl Chloe. And we watched all of his cartoons and looked up lists online of all characters, no mention of any Chloe in any of them, and we didn't know anyone with that name. Well, he always said he saw her and that she liked to spend time in his room, my room, and our middle brother's room. I moved out shortly after to be an adult, and about a year ago my parents moved out of that house. As fast as it started, my baby brother stopped talking about Chloe and has not mentioned her since. I'm not the parent, but it's about my brother. When we were young he went through imaginary friends pretty frequently. Not all that weird, except for why he stopped talking about the previous one. To this day it still freaks our entire family out. He would have an imaginary friend for a few months and talk about them non-stop. Then after a while, usually after waking up in the morning, he would tell us how in his dream they had died in a plane crash, or a car accident, or a shooting, or some other kind of tragic event like that, sometimes even naming the place in the world it happened. Without fail that night while watching the news there would be a story about some kind of tragic event having taken place the night before, and it almost always matched the description of the death of his imaginary friend. The weird and creepy part is that the only TV we had was in our parents' bedroom that was locked at night, and internet wasn't a thing back then, and he was so young that he was always at home with my mom and the other kids, so there was no way for him to have heard it from somewhere else. To this day we have no idea what was happening with that. I was the child with creepy imaginary friends. I don't have the actual memories, but up to age 7 or 8 I had dozens of them. According to my parents, I'd blame them for things I definitely did, but I'd phrase it like, "But I wasn't there, that was Alice inside my body, she did it." I'd also have full-on conversations with them as if they were standing right in front of me and I could literally see them. My mom would ask me about that and I'd say, "I can see them and hear them, but no one else can." Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and go into my parents' room and just stand and stare until they woke up scared shitless because there's this tiny demonic-looking little girl just staring them dead in the eyes going, "Mommy, Sally Maud me have a nightmare," in a completely monotone voice. So my parents got really freaked out by this stuff and briefly entertained the thought that I was talking to ghosts that occasionally possessed me. But I think I was a very, very lonely child with a vivid imagination. Not my kid, but my younger cousin had an imaginary friend she called Emily. She said to my mom, "Emily doesn't blame you, she's happy now," and described things about my mom and dad my cousin wouldn't know. Elizabeth was going to be the name of my older sister who my mom lost. Don't remember the full story. Just pregnancy lost or ended in some way, at 6 months because she formed into a glob instead of a baby. My family believed that Emily was the soul of my older sister that never had a chance to live. Not a parent but the now grown child with the imaginary friend. This was when I was approximately 4 years old. My imaginary friend had a surname for a first name, let's call him Smith. Smith looked like Inside Out Boy off Nickelodeon. From what I remember he had a skull t-shirt and glasses. All my family knew about Smith and he came with me everywhere. One day when I was maybe 6, me and my dad went to the tip to get rid of a bunch of stuff and Smith came with us, but for some reason I left Smith there. When we got back my mom asked where Smith was and I told her I'd left him at the tip and I apparently never spoke of him again. Fast forward to my teenage years and me and my mom commented on these banging noises we had heard for a few nights around the house. She suggested it could be Smith and we laughed it off. Around 2 weeks later we began getting daily phone calls from all sorts of companies. Kitchen fitters, banks, you name it. Asking for Mr. Smith. We've lived in that house 30 plus years and we're not Smiths? The phone calls eventually stopped but they lasted for at least 2 years. I moved out of my family home by myself last April and we joked that maybe Smith would come with me. I didn't hear sight nor sound of him. Until we ripped out the kitchen to replace it 3 months ago and I found a bill addressed to Mr. Smith. He's cool and harmless though, so I'm totally okay if Smith has actually been a ghost this whole time. Not really an imaginary friend but something still creepy. I don't know if it counts but I want to share. We briefly rented a townhouse while waiting to purchase a house. While living in this townhouse, I had always felt creeped out by my bedroom. It had a wall of windows on one side. Even as a grown woman, I felt uncomfortable being in the room after dark and felt like I was being watched by something in the room. I never mentioned it to my daughter. Fast forward to us living in our own house that we bought. My daughter starts having nightmares and is scared to be in her room. One night I asked her about the nightmares. She said it was of a ghost that said that he followed us from the room with all the windows. Not my kid, but as a kid I had a lot of imaginary friends. 2 that stand out a lot for my whole family were Makariah, not sure why she was called that. I hate McCarroll, and Geese. Makariah was a imaginary friend who generally did everything I wasn't allowed to do and according to me convinced me to do a lot of stupid shit like cutting the doll's hair, my hair, spray paint on the walls, ride a mattress down the stairs, that sort of stuff. Whenever my parents want to embarrass me they bring her up. Geese, however, was different. Where with Makariah I can't remember what she looked like. Geese I remember was a pale, eyeless boy who generally was not friendly. I think I make him because I was an angry kid growing up and from what I remember, he would whisper a lot of not pleasant things in my ear. I know that sounds stupid now as an adult, but as a kid my imaginary friends felt very real to me. My dad claims he doesn't remember Geese but my mom says she remembers I used to get upset because of him along with very angry. And for the record, I don't have any mental illnesses except for depression which is triggered from extreme stress. My wife and I were sitting for our nephew. He kept coming downstairs because there was a monster under his bed. So I marched upstairs, grabbed the monster from under the bed, dragged it downstairs, opened the door and threw it out into the night. Nephew burst into tears and was inconsolable because that was the nice monster and not the nasty monster. So 11 p.m. on a dark Saturday night and I am crawling around a damn wet garden looking for an imaginary monster and trying to apologize so my nephew could go to sleep. Heard my 3-year-old son talking up a storm in his room, pausing as if he's listening to another person answer him. No one was with him, so I asked who he was talking to and he said, "Grammy, she came for a visit." Grammy was my husband's grandmother who died in our house 3 years before our son was born. We figured she just wanted to spend some time with him. She stayed around for a couple months, then he never saw her again. We were walking home from a neighbor's house when we walked past a drain hole cover. My son stopped and looked down at the rainwater and said, "There is a little boy drowning down there, his name is Karakar." A combination between two Norwegian names, Kari, female name, and Kare, male name. My son is only 3 years old and we don't know anyone by these names, and I certainly didn't think he knew what drowning meant. He usually don't speak about it anymore, but sometimes he wakes up at night and just points to his baby born and say Karakar don't want to sleep. Kinda creepy but also kinda cute smile. I don't remember anything about my friend, other than their name. His name is Jimmy and he supposedly was a demon. My mom tells me I would have full conversation with my window frame, assuming that's where he would stay, and only stop talking when she noticed. She says she's asked me where Jimmy comes from and I told her he died and came back from the ground. She never asked about him again and I don't remember him at all. I had an imaginary friend named Super Steve. He could change sizes and would come and go as needed. I also had a whole bunch of random imaginary friends that I would see in different places. They were usually temporary. They would appear randomly at times I couldn't control, and they usually weren't there just to play with me. Sometimes they would tell me things. My mom asked me what the difference was between Super Steve and my temporary imaginary friends and I said, Super Steve is imaginary. My other friends are *** real. And I meant it. I'm still not sure if I was seeing ghosts, but that's another story. My mother told me this and I vaguely remember it too. When I was 3 years old for about a year, I would wake up around 3 a.m. every night to play and talk with Michael. I would talk about him often during the day, but I would only see him at night. I would go into my parents' bedroom every time he visited and let my mom know that I was playing with my friend. My mom was tired but accepted this as she assumed it was just a phase. One night, I told my mom, "Michael is here and he brought his mother to meet you." My mom replied, "Well, you tell Michael that I don't want to meet his mom and that if he is going to come over to play, he needs to visit during the day." I nodded and ran off to tell Michael. After that, I never saw him again. I vaguely remember what he looked like. He was a few years older than me with blonde hair. This was before I went off to school, so I don't think it was due to loneliness. I sometimes wonder if he was a ghost or a guardian. He seemed so real. Maybe I was just super imaginative. I don't know. But I remember talking to him. Youngest daughter one time asked us to keep our bedroom door open because her imaginary friend couldn't open doors. We laughed it off that she was just afraid and wanted to be able to see us or know we were home if she woke up in the middle of the night. Next day I casually asked what her friend did at night and she said she liked to stand at the end of our bed and watch us sleep. Creep alert number 1. We asked how often she speaks with her, and she said she really only likes to talk and come out at night. Creep alert number 2. We asked, "Can you draw a picture of her?" She did. If someone can advise how to attach it I can, but super creepy drawing, and we asked what was up with her smile and she said she had really sharp teeth and a lump on her head. Anyways, we eventually got a dog, and she told us her friend didn't like the dog because he stared at her at night. Long story short, we eventually moved. Her friend didn't come with us but daughter said she'd probably find us. That was 8 years ago. Haven't heard about her since we moved. We moved one more time since. I'm hoping she is lost. When I was working in a restaurant around 16, a young girl came into the kitchen looking around. I told her she shouldn't be back there due to it being a kitchen, as well as many raunchy employees working there, and proceeded to walk with her out to the front of the house. Considering it was slower than normal, I wanted to be polite as she was extremely articulate for her age, and I asked her a few questions about herself. It turns out she saw these floating eyeballs that told her where to go and what to do. She then showed me pictures which looked like something someone with schizophrenia would draw. The further we got into conversation, the more evident it was that she was extremely intelligent, yet consistently saw very weird and scary things, but she said she was used to it by now. To this day I still wonder what happened to her and what she's doing, as she must be 16 to 20 by now. My daughter was 4 and had 2 friends when we lived in a rental house. One was named Samantha. Samantha would insist on staying in my daughter's room most of time. Then my daughter would say that Samantha has to go to bed, and we asked where her bed was. She very nonchalantly told us she leaves the house when it gets dark and goes out the back door and sleeps under the grass. We opted not to investigate further. The other was a man that she called monsterist, or something close to that. He was very nice, according to her, and had long black hair and wore tan pants and funny shoes with no shirt. She said he was usually covered in blue and white, and according to the kid, would come, walk around the house and the yard, hang around and listen to music if we had some on, and would stand in the front yard until morning. We've since moved out of that house, and she has not uttered one thing about either friend visiting or anything. And #X200B. When I was little, I would go to bed, and in the middle of the night, get up on my hands and knees, and lightly hit the top of my head into my pillows. Never the headboard, only the pillows, but it would be over and over, like how people in shock uncontrollably rock and forth. My mom was kind of freaked out, thinking her kid was possessed or crazy, but I wasn't actively hurting myself, and in a few minutes, would stop and fall asleep. And she was a nurse, and it was the 80s when you didn't go to the doctor unless you were actively dying, so I don't fault her for letting it ride. Anyway, after it kept going, she finally called our family practice guy, who was super old even then, and he's like, "Well, did you ask her why?" Caveat. We learned later it's a sleep disorder and fairly common in young kids. They usually outgrow it as their brains develop, but it can be psychological, too. She asks if there's something in my room I don't like at night, thinking my bed or sheets are uncomfortable or there's a noise I'm hearing that won't let me fall asleep. I tell her there's a Nicky in the closet behind my dresser. She asks what a Nicky is. Apparently I'm not super articulate, but she figures out that it has sharp teeth and long fingers and it talks at night. She asks what it says. I tell her it doesn't have words, but it curls its fingers around the dresser and taps them like a drum to talk. I tell her it's stuck and it wants out. The next night I did it, rhythmic as a metronome. She shook me awake and said, "The Nicky got out and went away and it's not coming back. You need to go to sleep now." I guess I sat up, looked at the closet real hard, said, "Yes," and went back to bed and never did it again. TLDR. There was a monster in my closet that played the drums and I banged my head in time to them to fall asleep. While I'm not a parent, I do have a story about my younger brother's imaginary friends. In order for any of this to make sense, I need to explain that my sibling would frequently draw inspiration from things that I had said or done, but not quite hit the mark with his own attempts. For example, after I had purchased a poster to hang above my bed, he took it upon himself to stick an inch-wide clothing patch, the sort that you might sew to a jacket, above his. This kind of thing was pretty common, and it extended into make-believe scenarios. Anyway, one day when I was in elementary school, I wrote a fairly uninspired story about Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Princess Toadstool making their way to my neighborhood from the Mushroom Kingdom. This was back before Toadstool had retaken her original name of Peach. The plot saw the characters ejecting themselves from a television, then having to contend with real-world physics and such. My class had loved the tale, so that night, I recited it to my brother, pretending as though I was describing events which had taken place that very day. The boy was utterly spellbound. And furthermore, he immediately started playing along. We traded whispered details for hours, until long after we were supposed to have been asleep. Unfortunately, my brother's enthusiasm remained until the next morning, when he took it upon himself to recount our adventures to our mother. "The people from Mario came out of the television," he excitedly told her. "I had to tell them how to use knives because their fireballs didn't work." Somewhat absent-mindedly, our mother replied with, "It sounds like a fun dream." "No, it wasn't a dream," my brother angrily insisted. "I was awake. I couldn't sleep, because they got in bed with me. That's why I had to get knives from the kitchen." That got our mother's attention. An interrogation quickly followed, during which it was, eventually, established that none of the household's cooking implements had actually been stolen during the night. The question of why mustache-sporting men, even imaginary ones, had been allowed to climb beneath my brother's covers was also raised, then followed by a somewhat graphic lecture about never letting strangers into the house, let alone one's bedroom. Suffice it to say that I was never able to look at Mario in quite the same light. TLDR. My brother described an orgy with the Mario brothers. It turned into a knife fight. My daughter used to talk to the man and woman in the mirror when she was smaller. At first I thought she was talking to her own reflection, but soon after she would start to draw them. One night she climbed into bed with me crying cause the man and woman had climbed out of the mirror and were sitting at the end of her bed talking to her. She's 7 now and has no recollection of this, but my God, it still freaks me out. Not my kid but my nephew, he was around 6 years old when this happened. He always talked about his imaginary friend Beto, who at first was a kid like him but then grew up to be big like me. I was about 16. I used to take care of him almost 12 hours from Monday to Friday, so I was used to listen to my nephew talk about his friend. Beto used to leave dirty teacups on the kitchen counter, until I screamed at him to stop or at least wash the damn cup, and opened the doors for me when I had my hands full. So overall, a nice friendly ghost. One day I was washing the dishes while my nephew was playing in his room. I get this overwhelming feeling like there was something in the house, the dogs go crazy and all that jazz. Looked around, nothing. I returned to the kitchen trying to finish faster so I could sit next to my nephew. Then he runs to me, big smile on his face, asking if his mother was home. I said not for a few more hours, and he said, in the most nonchalant tone, "Oh, then who called my name and touched my shoulder?" Goosebumps everywhere. He said he was sure it wasn't Beto, because he was next to the front door looking angry. Not weird or creepy, but I'll tell it anyway. When my wife and I bought the house we now live in, our boys were 12 and 6. We bought the house from an older woman named Mrs. Kastner who lived alone. She made passing references to a Mr. Kastner, not too fondly I might add. I assumed he had died. Our boys heard me talking to my wife about how Mrs. Kastner had referred to her husband in the past tense. Not only did they come to the same conclusion that I had, but they further postulated that Mrs. Kastner had killed him and buried his body somewhere on the property. So every time something went missing in our house, it was the ghost of Mr. Kastner. The house made a creaking noise? Mr. Kastner was taking a stroll upstairs. We've talked about him as long as we've lived here. Reading this thread made me think of him, so I did some internet sleuthing. Turns out lovely Mrs. Kastner is not the murderer my boys pegged her to be, because her ex-husband, Mr. Kastner, is alive and well and living out of state, very near my now-grown eldest son. Mystery solved. My older daughter started having nightmares suddenly that lasted for a few weeks. Every night she'd be inconsolable about how there were parents in her room watching her at night. Each night, more parents. They were tall, they were thin, they were dark and creepy and wore tattered clothes. We had no idea what the hell, but were like, well, I guess we need a priest. Then we saw some scarecrows at a harvest fair. Look, Dad. Parents. No idea where she got parents from scarecrows. My mom told me a story of when I was very young, but around the time I started making coherent sentences. My parents were unpacking my great-grandpa's house because he had just died. My mom looked over to me and I had a rubber band in my hand. My mom had no idea where I could have gotten a rubber band, so she asked me where I got it. I said that man over there shot it at me. But when my mom asked me if it was my dad, I said no. Later when we went upstairs, there was a picture of my great-grandpa on the wall and I pointed at it and said that was the man who shot the rubber band at me. I don't remember it, but it's pretty creepy to think about. During childbirth I had complications. I almost died and my daughter actually did. They revived her and we have been happy and healthy since. Since an infant, toddler, she always looked around like she was watching something and just giggling at it. Fast forward to the age of 4 and she tells me about her first imaginary friend. Ghosty. All of her imaginary friends are ghosts. To this day she still talks to them at the age of 7. Some of her stories just give me the spooks. Unsure if they are real or not, I am always sure to be kind to my daughter's ghost friends and invite them along with us. My father became convinced, at age 5, that Lee Harvey Oswald, assassin of President Kennedy, was hiding in the attic. This was especially odd because the entire family had seen Oswald die on live television, after Jack Ruby shot him during his jail transfer. So, if Oswald was in my dad's attic, we had problems. Luckily my grandparents were of the generation that solved such things by completely ignoring them, so my dad grew up to be the kind of father who would say to me, "Oh, you think there's a monster in the closet? Ask him if he's Lee Harvey Oswald. No maladjustment here, Nozare." In the past I have seen things out of the corner of my eye and glanced to see nothing there. Of course that's just my eyes being weird and I stopped paying attention to those things. Well, my daughter is just a toddler and I had her sitting in my lap reading a book. I see something in the corner of my eye as usual and my daughter quick looks over there. She then stares wide-eyed at nothing and watches it cross through the room. This has happened 3 times. She's not at the point to where she can communicate what she is looking at, but we are pretty close. If it happens again, I'll ask her what she sees. Out of my 4 kids, only my eldest son, now 20 years old, had an imaginary friend. Its name was Barcy and it was a giant wolf, but could transform into a boy. Anyway, my wife and I didn't think much about Barcy until we noticed that my son had broken a plastic butter knife and stabbed quite a few of his stuffed animals. He told us that Barcy had told him to do and had even helped. That was when we really got concerned. My son had anger issues as a child, and the reason for that is that, while I call him my son, he is my stepson. His biological father lost custody because of drug-related crimes and just abandoned him. My son has always thought of me as his dad, but was still extremely angry about the situation with his biological. Anyway, we took him in to get some counseling after an incident involving a lighter that he found on the ground outside our apartment. He had tried to burn his baby brother's favorite toy. While in counseling, it came to light that Barcy was planning to eat our family and to pee our blood all over the apartment. This was the beginning of my son's counseling and mild medications. Barcy disappeared over a few months and we were able to take my son off the medication the following year. He remained in counseling for quite a few years, but Barcy was never mentioned again. This isn't creepy, just odd. My 4-year-old son's current imaginary friend is Haris Suhail, a Pakistani cricketer who plays in the National League in Pakistan. He apparently has the same teddies as my son, cycles alongside him and went on a camping holiday with us last summer. We are Irish living in Ireland. My husband plays cricket a little during summer, but he cannot for the life of him understand where my son learned about Mr. Suhail. So my 3-year-old started talking about her friend, Arlo, telling us stuff she did that was funny. We assumed she was talking about a friend of hers from school and made up stories about them playing together. Nothing alarming or weird, pretty much how she talked about the other little kids in her Head Start class. We came to find out that in fact that is no Arlo in her school. Still, maybe she's just being lazy pronouncing a name or something. When we asked her about it, she pretty much said Arlo doesn't go to school. So that was weird, but we figured, whatever, she just had an active imagination. It got hot outside around this time and we live a couple houses down the street from the local beach. A new ice cream guy started hitting the beach religiously like 6 times a day. I get it, that's obviously a guaranteed couple sales every time he swings through. Our daughter really liked the music and wanted to know why he played music, and obviously not wanting to have to listen to her beg for ice cream 6 times a day all summer long, we told her that he's just the music man and he comes by to play music. This was right when lockdown was in full effect in our area, and other than going to the lake there wasn't much to do. Her school stopped, and we honestly didn't go outside beyond our yard or the grocery store and work for most of the summer. So she hasn't hung out with many kids in the past couple weeks. Anyway, one day she hears the ice cream guy come to the park and all excitedly tells me that that's not a music man, he's a ice cream man and he sells ice cream. Arlo told me that you lied and said he was a music man, Dad. So that was kind of creepy. We asked where Arlo lives and she told us she lives in her closet. And that was the last time I ever asked more information about Arlo. I am telling the story on behalf of my mother. When I was 4 till 8, I had an imaginary friend, Olivia, who was like me. I remember her clearly. Olivia was nice to me up until my mom left the room. Then she'd be *TCH and I was friends with her only because I didn't have legit friends. One day, told Olivia I didn't want to be friends anymore and she threatened me that she would cause trouble in the nights. So, when the night came, me and my mum started hearing some weird ass noises coming from the living room. When mum wondered to herself WTF happened, I told her, "Mummy, Olivia is bad. She is mean to me and threatened me that if I stopped being friends with her, she would never let us sleep peacefully again." Mum looked like she was having a stroke after I said that. Fun time smiley face. My son, 5 now, used to frequently tell us about his blue family. He would tell us stories about the places they went and the things they did. Mostly it was they went to some place that had a thing that looked like this, and he'd make a few motions or draw a picture, and he would always break into tears afterwards. If we asked why he was crying, he would just say he missed them. At first we thought it was dreams. The As he grew older, and smarter, he'd get better at describing the things they did. Till one day he told us about a food they ate. He managed to describe a recipe to us perfectly for chicken parmigiana. We had never made this for him and no one else had ever watched him. But we bought the things and made the recipe and gave it to him. He just looked at me in all seriousness and said, "No, these are for her." It was her favorite food. He walked away from the table and went to bed. We ate dinner and then he never brought it up again. My son has an imaginary dog called Banjo. The creepy thing is that Banjo was the name of our family dog a long time ago when I was still a preteen. We lived on a farm close to a river. One day there was a flash flood and my brother was trapped on a rocky hill with raging flooding river all around him and farm animals could be seen being swept away by the current. Our dog Banjo unfortunately jumped in the river to save my brother but got carried away by the current and we never saw him again. After 11 hours the water was safe enough for a boat to collect my brother and he was beside himself with sadness over what happened to Banjo. My brother sadly died after being hit by a car while cycling 2 years later when he was 13. I never told my son about Banjo, so I was very shocked when he began interacting with this invisible dog called Banjo. Is it just coincidence? Or is it the spirit of my long-dead brother or the spirit of the long-dead Banjo who is visiting my new family?